welcome to another episode of our Detection Engineering Dispatch series. I am Alex, hosting all of your dispatch content consisting of all things detection engineering related, discussions, use cases, workshops that we just had on our last episode on cybersecurity report writing. If you haven't checked that one out, I'm going to link it here in the chat. It was very, very great workshop with Kevin Zuck. So if you enjoy our content and you want to stay in the loop with it, please subscribe to our email list and join us right here on Zoom live bi-weekly, or you can catch the replays on our YouTube channel. Today, we are very delighted to have a frequent guest on the series back on with us, Tim Frazier. Thank you for coming on. And Tim and I both are very excited to have Andrew VanVleet, which you may know him from his very, very well known, very well respected threat detection focused blog. He writes really great pieces on a lot of topics that we're going to be covering today. And so, Tim, before I turn it on over to you, I just wanted to let our listeners know that if you guys have any questions for these guys, I can ask them for you on your behalf. Just drop it in the chat, and I'll ask it live. So, Tim, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate that. And yes, we are excited to be here today talking about detection engineering strategy. I will give a quick disclaimer to say that most of the valuable content from today's session comes from Andrew. So he has written the blog post on this, and I've had several discussions with him about this, and we thought it would be a great topic to share with the wider audience, because I know I benefited from it, thinking about his approach to the strategy and how we're going to tackle that today. Like Alex said, feel free to throw a question in the chat along the way. We'd love to make this interactive. That's kind of the purpose of doing these things live. So looking forward to sharing this content with you and having a valuable discussion. All right. So quick introduction. I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I cover sales engineering here at AmVlogic. Worked at various companies on the vendor side as well as a practitioner. I do enjoy wakeboarding, wake surfing. It's kind of a fun hobby of mine, as well as dad jokes as we started off. For those of you that joined late, the dad joke of the day is, what do Alexander the Great and Winnie the Pooh have in common? Same middle name. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. So funny backstory here. I was so impressed with Tim's dad jokes that at one point I actually attempted to tell one to my own children, only I bungled the punchline about halfway through. So I definitely do not have the dad joke delivery that he does. He's a master in his class. So my name is Andrew VanVleet. I'm based out of American Fork, Utah. I am a passionate detection engineer and threat hunter. I have about 20 years of experience in cyber. A good chunk of that, about a decade, was spent at American Express. I spent some time at ICS CERT doing threats to critical infrastructure, and then I spent about another half of that time, about 8 years, at a three-letter U.S. agency doing cyber intelligence and analysis. I am a budding indoor rock door climbing enthusiast, and I'm a longtime lover of just about anything you can do outdoors. So excited to talk today.
Yeah, excellent. Andrew, we've talked numerous times about his vacations that often involve hiking, much more physical exertion and activity than my vacations involve, unless I'm walking all around Disney World or something. But all right, but here today, we're trying to talk about detection strategy, if I could ever stay on topic. So why are we going to do that? I think it's important to spend some time and really dig down into the motivation of this. Some people may ask, well, why don't we just get busy and get working? But I think it's important to kind of zoom out for a minute and really think about what we're doing and how we're doing it best. So in terms of motivation for this, Andrew, what's motivated you to kind of really look at detection strategy?
Yeah, so this really it kind of came out of that decade I told you I spent at American Express. So that time I was there as a threat hunter and detection engineer for a full decade. Same job, same position. Had a lot of time to kind of develop content, maintain that content, and then see how that content actually performed over the long run. At Amex, we had a very capable red team. There's actually a handful of those red teamers on with us today. So to you guys, thanks for helping make me think about this. But essentially what happened is, I would build detections there at Amex, and then over the course of time, our red team would they'd run exercises and they would test those techniques. And there were There were the successes that I felt great about where I caught them, but there were a lot of points where they would exercise a technique and I thought that I had it covered, yet they would manage to evade my detection. And this was a frustrating but illustrative experience that caused me to kind of step back, especially when it happened, over and over again for a while, where I kind of had to start looking at it and say, why is this happening? Why are they getting past my detection? And how can I be more likely to succeed against the next attack? So as I started stepping back, I kind of had to ask myself, what do I think the probability is that I'm going to find the next attack on our network, be it red team or be it a real attack? Like, given that I don't know what they're going to throw at me, what are my real chances of successfully detecting this thing? And as I did that, there were a couple things that kind of became apparent to me. One of them was I started to just think strategy, right? Like, well, what's the best game plan to be able to actually catch them? Maybe they're going to go through techniques I've already planned, or maybe, sometimes they would try using technology or things that just I hadn't thought about at all yet. And they just go right around what I thought was this powerful wall and they just, end run all the way around it. So part of it was that was what got me to start thinking about the strategy, about how can I really make it more likely I'm going to win this. The second one was that I realized that I really need to have a better, deeper understanding of the attack techniques that I was up against. And I'm going to take just a little bit of tangent on this one, and then I'm going to circle back. So I think that we in the industry, in the blue team, we kind of have like a script kiddie problem to some degree. We use the term script kiddie as this derogatory term to refer to attackers who don't understand the attacks that they're using. They can only run the command lines that they're given or the tools that they're given. They can run it in the variant that they are provided by somebody else, but no more than that, right? I think that as I started looking at these points where the red team had gone through my detections, I started to realize that I was kind of working like a blue script kiddie. I understood the command line of the attack. I understood the idea of the attack, but I didn't understand how it could be varied. I couldn't implement it myself. Sometimes I didn't understand the technologies that were being abused to make that attack possible, right? So I was kind of no better off than these script kiddies who couldn't really make any variations. And as I started looking at it, I realized, the one common theme I can see here is that the next attack almost never looks exactly like the last attack, but I'm detecting the last attack. So they do it. I set up this great defense for it. I'm like, I'm ready. And then they vary it and they go right through me again. So I started to realize that, if I want to do this successfully, I got to be better than a script kiddie. I got to skill up myself. And I got to find a way to look at these attack techniques in a way that makes sure that I'm going to be able to see the variants that are coming at me, and I'm going to be ready for those, right? So bringing that back to what we're talking with strategy, that's why I think we need to talk strategy. In threat detection, success is really hard to measure when we don't have frequent and varied attacks. Things are usually pretty quiet, right? And that's great because everything seems fine until you find out that it wasn't actually fine, right? So strategy helps us kind of think about how am I going to succeed when I get one shot, right? It also makes us step back and think about how well we're actually doing before we find out the hard way, right? So I think that that's kind of the purpose of strategy, is to take that long, hard look at the mirror at ourselves and at our strategy, at our approach, at our efforts, at our outcomes, and ask ourselves, like, do I think I'm really setting myself up so that I'm most likely to win the next encounter? Right?
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you talk about that situation where the red team comes in and, finds the way through. I remember one time when this was before purple teaming was a thing, right? And we've since kind of adopted that term where the red and blue work together. But I went over to, one of the guys that was on our internal red team, and he kind of was showing me this new tool, PowerShell Empire at the time, right? And it was like, oh, we got to try this thing out. And I was like, yeah, let's see what we detect. We have, packet capture, we got a SIM, we got logman, all this stuff, right? We got a new endpoint tool we're trying to test out. So he runs it and of course gets the shell and, he's got live connection, pulling stuff, like getting screenshots, all this. And I'm like looking over at the SIM. I'm like, man, where's the alert on that? We got nothing. This is really not good. So, it's only with those things where people are using actual tradecraft, right, that we really get a full kind of understanding of what our defenses actually are. And like you said, that we need to come at it from that approach of thinking, how can we really understand what the adversaries are doing, both red team and real attackers, right? Before we find out the hard way, as you identify.
Absolutely.
One other note I want to make though, when you talk about blue team script kiddies, man, it's really hard to understand a lot of this stuff at a technical level. And I think that's one thing that's intimidating, especially to a lot of people first starting this, right? Like just wrapping your mind around all the different things that we can detect and then really trying to understand what we're going to get to today, which is how to detect it more comprehensively. Like this is not easy, right? So just give yourself a little bit of grace. And to your point, like I think it starts by admitting that we're script kiddies, right? In the real sense of the term, is to be okay with saying, look, I don't really understand all the stuff that's going on here, but I'm going to commit to really learning and figuring this out, especially if you don't come from a computer science background, right? It's can be a lot. So just putting that disclaimer out there for anybody. All right, let's move on. So what are we trying to do with this session today and with our detection engineering strategy is realistically, it's thinking about how do we best prioritize our efforts so that we can get the most bang for our buck, right? We all live in a limited world where we can't detect everything. We can't get to that 100%. And talk about today why you may not need to. But we also want to think about good detections versus better detections versus best detections, right? It's not just good and bad, although there's a lot of those. How do we actually strive for the ideal detection? And we'll talk about a couple of different ways to approach that. Anything to add on this one before we dive in, Andrew?
Yeah, I in my blog post, I actually kind of offer a little bit of pseudo math to try and be able to evaluate one detection against the other. But what I was kind of going for is, during that decade, there's always these debates where you have about what makes a detection good or bad, or why is this strategy better than the other. And my goal was to try to add a little bit more kind of objective analysis to what pattern would make a better detection than the other, rather than just being my opinion versus your opinion and how many years we've been doing it. So that's kind of what we're going to try to set up here, is a way to objectively evaluate a detection and say this one is probably a better pattern than that.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't need to be in the room arguing over the emotional investment we have in our detections because we wrote it, right?
Yeah, especially when that attachment decreases, a year and two later after you have to maintain it. By 3 years after, it's like the worst thing you've ever written, right?
Right, exactly. All right, so Andrew was kind enough to put some good visuals into his blog post that we've linked here down at the bottom. And this, feel free to Google for his blog post if you want to read it. He dives into very solid concrete detail there, but we've lifted a few of the visuals here to kind of explain the concept. So Andrew, I'll let you speak to this.
Yeah, so the idea here was I wanted to kind of build a visual model so it'd be really easy to kind of think through. I'm a very visual person, and I wanted to be able to have kind of this model that makes it easy to think through the strategy. So the idea here is I took the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which I hope all of us are very familiar with at this point. It should inspire feelings of at least nausea when you see it. MITRE does a really good job of kind of cataloging all of the attacks that we are, at least, that attackers are known to be using. So I started there, and what I did is I just kind of represented each attack technique or sub-technique as just a dot, just to simplify it out, right? So if we look at each one of those as a dot, then what we can do is we can kind of look at an attack on our network as a path that is being forwarded from dot to dot to dot to go from initial access to impact, whatever the attacker's objective is on the network. And they're going to be, in order to do each of these tactics they want, each of the objectives they have on your network, they're going to have to pick some technique along this path. So we can kind of abstract this process and say, the attacker is this red line moving through our network, and the techniques are all of the options they have available for them to be able to choose a given, or to accomplish a given objective on the network. And then if we do that, our objective as the blue team is to cover enough of these dots in this universe of attack surface such that we have a high probability that an attacker trying to get that path to the network is going to trigger something that alerts us to their presence, right? Really simple. That's kind of the basic idea. And the model kind of shows that, where we want to maximize the probability. So looking at it this way, we're really kind of playing this game of probability with the attacker, where we're trying to get to the point where the probability is in our favor that the attacker on some point going through our network is going to notify us by doing something where we have an alert that they're there, and then we can start our incident response process and push them back out, right? So that's kind of the initial idea of the model itself. itself. By setting up the model like this, we can also start talking a little more about the strategy, and then that can suggest to us kind of what some better patterns are to help us increase the probability of winning, and maybe what some patterns that really don't help us increase that probability are as well. But before we get to those, I kind of wanted to talk just a minute about compounding probability. So I promise this will be kind of the only math we're going to do today. I'm not really a math whiz. But if you guys remember in math, way back when, the idea of compounding probability is the likelihood of a particular event happening a certain number of times. So, the classic one is flipping a coin. What's the likelihood that you're going to flip a coin and get heads 5 times in a row? And you'll remember from your math days that the chances of that happening over and over and over again just get smaller and smaller and smaller. The idea here for us is that every time an attacker takes an action on our network, they're rolling the dice, right? So they're taking a gamble that whatever it is that they're about to do, you don't have a detection in place for that's going to notify you that they're there. And each time they do that, it's another roll of the dice for them. So we don't need to have 100% coverage of the attack surface in order for us to win this game, right? And if we look at it, so let's imagine that we only have, say, a 33% coverage. We cover 1/3 of the techniques kind of uniformly across our attack surface, right? If that's the case, then every time the attacker takes an objective, they have essentially a 2 in 3 chance, or a 66% chance of winning. The first action they take, they've got 66% odds that they will do it without you finding it. That's pretty good. But by the second time and the third time and the fourth time, the likelihood of them choosing correctly every single time goes down and down and down. So that the example I've got here is if they have an attack that takes just 5 steps from initial access to impact, and you have 33% coverage, they're down to a 12.5% chance that they will successfully choose an attack technique that you don't have covered all the way through those 5 techniques. So even on a very, 5 steps is a very fast attack chain, right? But even with just a 33% coverage, that probability really is in our favor at the blue team right now. Those odds look pretty good. And if we can move our coverage up even higher, those odds start to look really good, especially against long attack chains. So the idea here with compounding probabilities is this is actually something that's really a big ally to us on the blue team. Red team has to be successful repeatedly over the course of the entire operation in order for them to get to impact, right? Red team attackers, either one.
Yeah, I think it flips the adage on its head, right? We've heard that expression where blue team has to be right every time, but red team only has to be right once in order to get in and to win, right? But I think to your point, if we break it down into, it's not just one time that the red team has to do something, they're doing a series of actions, or the attackers are doing a series of actions, and we kind of use this compounding probability in our favor. Makes me feel like the house, right? We know the house always wins whenever we go to Vegas. So
that's right.
But if only it was that simple, right? Interesting thing that just occurred to me as we're talking about this. How would you say, because obviously, attacker techniques and minor attack techniques are not uniformly distributed, such as dice rolls and other Gaussian distributions, right? How can we say that this probability holds true when attackers are probably more likely to use certain techniques over others?
Yeah, that actually kind of works in our favor to some degree, because we know that, definitely some attackers, let's say we're looking for a particular attacker, we know they have some kind of favorite techniques, which means that if we cover their favorites, then we actually increase the odds even better in our favor, right? There's also, without getting the math too complicated beyond the point of my own ability to comprehend it, but I actually had a conversation with some of the industry recently about kind of bottlenecks, where there's kind of certain points where like an attacker really kind of has to do this before they can move on, right? And those bottlenecks are really a good point where if we cover those even more densely, then we actually increase that probability even more. So we're kind of abstracting this and saying, let's just pretend that this is a uniform field, and we just want to cover it all the way across. But you're right, in real life, it gets even more complicated. And if we know our network well, we can actually start to put the coverage into the places that are most critical, right? Like the crown jewels, if we can harden those, then we have an even better probability that before they can impact them, we'll get to it, right? So that helps a lot. I actually think in a lot of cases, a lot of the modern EDRs are really good on the initial access side of things as well. which is probably why we don't have like every company in the United States breached every day, is that they've really tipped that probability in our favor by getting that initial access really hard to gain, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say every company's not breached that we know of. Many of them don't like to talk about it, but yeah.
This is a fair point. Yep.
So, all right, but moving on. Too much math for me. Anyway, I'm kidding. It's good. So let's dive into the actual model itself, the effective detection patterns that we're going to talk about here. So more visuals. Let's go.
Yeah, so more visuals. So, when we take this idea of paths through the dots, the best strategy we're going to have to increase our probability is to cover as many dots as possible, right? We don't know what an attacker is going to do. Like that universe of dots, they can do any of them. They don't have to do persistence. They don't necessarily have to escalate privileges. We don't really know where they're going to be, but we do know that they're going to have to pick some dots, right? They can't get onto our network and do something bad to us without doing some of these things. So our goal is to really cover as comprehensively as possible, as many dots as possible. And the more of them we can cover, the more likely we are to have that probability work in our favor. So there are a few practical things that go into here, right? When we're building a detection, the ideal detection from this purely theoretical standpoint would be the detection that covers the most dots, period, right? From a practical standpoint, it's very hard to maintain and build a detection that's looking for a lot of disparate things. Like you don't want to be the guy who comes in to maintain a detection that's looking for literally 50 different techniques all at once, right? Like good luck with that. So from a practical standpoint, the easiest place to focus our efforts is to look at the sub-technique or technique level, like the smallest one. If it's a technique with sub-techniques, it's a sub-technique level. Because those are going to be things that tend to be related and may even have a bottleneck point where we can actually detect multiples of those sub-techniques with just one detection, or with a small cluster of detections that are all commonly themed, easy to group, easy to maintain. By doing that, and we're going to, I keep using this word comprehensive. We're actually going to dive into what we really mean by comprehensive, because that's a critical point. But by comprehensively covering as many of these dots as we can, kind of the sub-technique level, we're going to be pushing upward that probability that we're going to have them trigger something that we're aware of, right? So that's going to be our most effective detection, is a sub-technique detection that comprehensively covers one sub-technique. Now, there's kind of some patterns here that are also less effective. So, one thing I'm seeing a lot in the industry lately is this sequential or tuple pattern, where if an attacker does A and then B and then C, we throw a detection. I think this is really popular because by the time an attacker has done A, B, and C, there's a really high likelihood that that's malicious, right? These things are very, very low on false positives, because what normal person is going to do both A, B, and C in the realm of possibly malicious things that's not trying to do something malicious. The problem with this pattern is that we are expecting an attacker to do an exact series of things, right? So if you look at the picture there, I've got this path through the network. The detection, imagine, is that yellow line. So I've just got a two-tuple detection. If attacker does A and then B, we're going to alert on it. But the problem with that is the attacker can do A or B. As long as they don't do A and B, you won't detect them, right? So the problem with that is that let's imagine for now that we got just 500 sub-techniques in the entire universe of MITRE. That's obviously a low ball, but let's just imagine, because it makes math easy. If we have 500 sub-techniques and we're covering them one sub-technique at a time, that means we have to cover 500 sub-techniques. That's overwhelming, but doable. If we turn these into just two-tuple combination, where we're going to look at one A and then B, B and then C, A and then C, whatever, these 500 sub-techniques become 124,000 two-technique sequences. Building 124,000 detections for those sequences, though they would be high fidelity, would be an overwhelming task. Probably a downright impossible task, right?
Hold on. You said there was no more math, Andrew. We just got into math again for a second. No,
you're right. I'm terrible at math. Or jumping into math.
You're right. The reality is you're not going to create that many of those detections, and nor should you, right? Clearly, from a probability standpoint, that's a losing strategy.
Absolutely. And, I talked about it in another post. We're not going to get this today, but I think each company has a certain threshold of the number of detections they can actually maintain. from a standpoint of what your theme can automate and run and what you can actually build and what you can troubleshoot. And there's this upward threshold. And I think that threshold is well below 124,000. So I think that would really be an impossible task.
Right.
Which would say that this sequential pattern really is one that is not helping us win that game of probability, right? I'm going to throw, I think, the last math at you. If we look at a new detection in the terms of incremental coverage, a detection that's covering one sub-technique comprehensively gives you, in our theoretical world of 500, 1/500th of your attack surface is now covered. A technique that covers a sequence of two things is giving you a 1/124,000th incremental coverage. And at that point, we can see that pattern is not helping us win this game, right? That's it's just a waste of our time, really. So yeah, big X on that pattern. The other pattern, though, that does work really well here is I'm calling these a groupal, for lack of a better name. The idea here is that we're not looking for specific tuple sequences, but we're looking for groups of things. And AnvLogic does this or can do this in what you guys call scenarios, right? Where we're looking for, let's say there's a technique under MITRE's initial access followed by a persistence. Any initial access followed by any persistence on the same host in a certain time frame. That allows us to say, there is something probably going on here on this asset. And what this allows us really to do is, one of the difficulties we have when we're trying to cover things comprehensively is some things we can't really cover because they're too noisy, right? I've thrown my head against the brick wall of malicious scheduled tasks so many times in my career, and I have never done anything but bloody myself. It's just impossible to find a malicious scheduled task in an enterprise scale environment, period, right? So you have these techniques that there's too much noise, or there's just not high fidelity telemetry that you can say something happened, but I can't really high confidence say this is malicious. So these groupal detections allow you to take those warnings or those signals that are lower confidence and then group them together. So if you have a warning signal that is initial access and then another warning that comes in at persistence, this groupal will allow you to throw a detection on that and just increase again the probability that a certain pattern, a certain set of combinations, these things are all things that the attacker has to worry about when they roll that dice, and just make it sure the house always wins. So those are kind of some of the patterns that we look at that will actually help make us win this threat or this game.
Yeah, I mean, I love the the description of the second pattern there that you're dubbing groupal, right? When I first read this term that you had started using in your blog posts and everything, I was like, man, we should call it that. No, I didn't say that. I was like, scenarios are good. But I like the term, though. I still do. I think it's interesting. It doesn't necessarily market well, although I think it could. There's potential there. But the idea of being able to group those things together and saying like, hey, we actually have these things that are very noisy, and we can't use them in isolation, but we can actually put them with something else that may be noisy. But those two noisy things will very rarely occur on the same host within a certain time period, right? So we can find the rarity by grouping those warning signals together. So I get why you did it with tuple to groupal, but man, it's just
they just need a cute plushy mascot to take off, I think, Tim.
There you go. That's what we need. Yes. We'll see if we can make that work. But so those two main patterns, right? The one comprehensive around the sub technique or the technique level, whichever we can get to, all those ways of doing. And then the second being grouping the noisy warning signals together. And we're getting ready to dive in on that number one here next, right?
Yeah. So now comes the big question of, what do we mean by comprehensive? Because I think that up until now, you could look at this and say, okay, this is threat detection 101. Like what do we really need to do differently here? And I think this is where we get at it. So what you're seeing here on the screen, this is actually something I borrowed from an excellent blog series by Jared Atkinson, where he takes the technique of dumping the LSAS process and breaks it out into specific operations, kind of abstracts those operations, and then maps out all of the ways that he has found published to do LSAS dumping, right? And what it comes down to is that there were essentially four different procedures by which you can dump the LSAS process. Some of them share things. For example, we can see here right on the left of kind of the way where it branches there's an operation called process access. You have to open the LSAS process in order to dump it. So they all kind of share that common spot. And then they have kind of a point where they diverge. Some of them use a process creation approach. Some take a snapshot. Some try copying the handle to the process, each of them giving them a different approach that some EDRs just miss. And then they all converge ultimately on actually reading out of the LSAS process. So by taking a technique and breaking it out into this, and I call this a detection data model. I actually have a blog post up as well where I kind of show how to create these models for any given technique and how it can help you really analyze the technique. This helps kind of get past the whole blue script kitty. Like, this is where you can really make sure you get it and that you can get the variance for it, right? Because you can look at this and say, what else could I do to get this same impact, but traverse a different path through this network, through this operation map, right? Operation map. So the idea here with comprehensive is that we're talking about comprehensively covering a technique. We want to cover all 4 of those procedures if we can. And there's a couple ways of going about it, right? Like those bottlenecks there, if you can find a way, maybe at process access, that you can find them all there, outstanding, right? That's something that an attacker has to do. We find an immutable way that they have to do it, and we detect that. Well, we've got a really good way of detecting LSAS dumping or this particular technique, all 4 procedures right there. Oftentimes that will not be the case, and we're going to have to actually put together detections that are going to find maybe 1 or 2 of them, and then another one. We'll get a collection of detections that will, between all of them, cover each of these. But the real main idea here by comprehensive is that when we build this, we want to understand all the procedures. We want to understand what is essential, what has to happen, and what's immutable. What does an attacker have to do exactly this way in order for them to be able to successfully complete this, right? So with LSAS, they have to open a handle to the LSAS process. It has to have a few specific permissions, right? So that would be a great place for us to be looking for the possibility of detecting this particular one comprehensively. So that's the idea of comprehensive. Now, I actually want to take this a step forward and talk about what we don't mean by comprehensive. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see in the threat detection industry right now. So that is when we focus on something that is changeable or non-essential. And I'm going to just throw this out there. I know this will maybe not be popular, but command lines are changeable and non-essential. So not a good idea, right? So what I've done here with this operation graph, I've actually added to the left of it a representation of the specific tools that will implement one of these procedures. If we're building a detection that is finding one tool, we have found one of infinite possible implementations of this procedure. That's not really helping increase the probability that we're going to find this procedure, right? If we found one command line, like we specified the specific command line of that tool, I mean, we're down to like just absolutely minute additional coverage against this technique, because an attacker has literally infinite options that they can execute that don't use the path that we've chosen to build our tool for, right?
Right. I think the term that I've seen for that type of detection is a brittle, right? Because it can easily be broken, where you're kind of honing in on one specific thing that may be a modifiable or even obfuscatable element, right? Where it's like, oh, well, I can just use variable substitution or some, obfuscation to kind of get past that way of detection. I think, though, in defense of command line, right, to play the devil's advocate for a second, is that that's a source of telemetry that is well understood, right? We have ways to collect that. We have ways to gather that. We have ways to analyze that. And oftentimes that's the kind of the place where we forensically start to kind of deconstruct what has happened, because oftentimes that gives us the history, right? Whether it's your kind of your bash history, or, some sort of Windows events, or with process command line parameters, et cetera, or from EDR telemetry, right? Getting into the handles, or, the things that are happening where you really have to hook in at a lower level to understand. I mean, goodness gracious, not everybody even has command line, right? How are we going to get to this next level of telemetry?
Yeah. And those are good points, Tim. Those are very good points. Obviously command line definitely is a great way for instant response to figure out what happened when we're piecing together the breadcrumbs of what went down. Those are some excellent breadcrumbs. But I think really at this point, this is where we as a blue industry really need to ask more of ourselves, right? Like, we have those command lines, but I think if we were honest with ourselves about what they provide to us, a lot of times they're just kind of a fig leaf for coverage, right? Like they're not a shield. They're not actually preventing an attacker from doing things on our network. They just make us feel good because we tell ourselves that we'd find the command line. And the thing that really illustrated this to me best, some of our red teamers here will be chuckling, is we had an exercise, this was years ago, where I had covered the command line for this attack technique as comprehensively as you can imagine. I had built in obfuscation resistance. I had looked at every way you could do it. And they did this attack technique using the binary expected, and I still didn't detect them. And I found out later what happened was that they had just loaded the stupid binary into an existing process, modified the command line in memory, and run it. And I never saw the stupid command line in my log. Like it literally would have detected if they just typed it in command exe, Miles, if you're listening, but they didn't, right? And that was the point where I just had this like moment of, I can't trust the command line ever. Like I cannot really believe that that command line is going to come because there's so many ways they can change it, not run it. Like there's just too many options. There are literally infinite. It's in their, I'm putting the game in their court. I'm shifting the probability in their favor.
You're making them the house, man. Come on.
Yeah,
the house always
that's
wins.
Right. So I think that, we do this a lot as an industry. You look at the public repos, most of them, the detected content out there is command line based, right? And I think part of that is that, it's hard to get that telemetry. It's hard to deploy it. It's hard to convince people that we should pay to have it. But I think we need to have kind of a long, hard conversation about what is it that I can really detect? What kind of protection can I provide to our company if all I have to go on is a command line, right? If you think the only thing we're going to go up against is script kiddies, we're good. We're golden. But if you think you're going up against someone who can obfuscate or remove that command line, inject their code, change their code, write their own code, you're probably just carrying around a fig leaf, right? So I think there's a point where we kind of need to push harder. And kind of another story on that, I actually had an experience a couple of years ago where I was going through process injection. That was my hobby technique at the time. And I went through every single means of injecting a process in Windows, and I implemented every single one of them. And I made this binary that would mix and match, whether it wrote it in memory or whether it mapped it into memory, and all these ways of doing it. And then I ran it against our EDR tool, and the results were not great. They were really not encouraging. So I put together this like presentation where I put every single one of them, and then I had some things in there where I said, if you would give me this in the log you're already providing. Like when you're looking at this and you have this log, just give me this field and this field and this field. I think I could build detections for these. And they actually took that and they turned it into a major re-engineering effort where it took them about 1.5 years to actually deliver the final product, but they entirely re-engineered how they detected process injections. And by the time they were done, I could find 95% of the process injection techniques on my network with the telemetry that they had provided. So it's not a fast process, but I think it's possible for us to expect more, both of ourselves and of our EDR and our operating system providers, to say, I want more than a command line because that's not really going to protect me. And I think that what has to happen, though, is we have to be able to get past our script kiddie state where we're looking at these and we're saying, if you'd give me this telemetry, when this call is made, I can detect that. And that's a pretty good case. You're telling them what you want, where you want it, and how to do it. It'll take 1.5 years, but maybe you'll get it.
Nice. Sounds like it might work maybe a little better, maybe on par with writing a letter to your congressperson. Is that what I'm hearing? Or
maybe better than that. I've never had much luck with a congressperson.
All right. All right. So, hey, we can petition our vendors and our, the folks that help us with security to do better. Right. But I think it's a multifaceted challenge that, it's going to take steps. It's going to take, things that we've got to do. To your point is that, saying it's hard is not going to solve the problem, but it is, it's one of those things that if it was easy, we would have already been doing it. Right. All right. Well, we need to land this plane. Let's bring it back. So kind of in summary for the questions that we started with, the best place to focus these efforts would be at the sub-technique level. It's kind of the conclusion that hopefully this talk and your blog post have equally come to. But the idea of evaluating the quality of detection is being that comprehensiveness with respect to the individuals. And then as we talked about, but it's not represented on this slide, the idea of, working with the reality, the practical, which oftentimes, requires us to do that Drupal type approach where we're saying, look, we can't get as specific or as comprehensive without introducing a lot of noise, whether it's scheduled tasks like you mentioned, or one of my favorite examples is encoded PowerShell, right? A lot of this type of activity happens on the network. It is a common attacker technique. How do we best use it for detection? Well, we combine it with, other things that would take place around it if we were actually being subjected to a real attack. So, we're coming up on 45 minutes. As a bonus, we're just going to talk real quick about detection engineering versus threat hunting. We'll keep this to a couple of minutes, but just as a teaser for the next episode, right, Andrew?
Maybe. Yeah. So the idea here is, we in the industry use the term threat detection and threat hunting almost synonymously. Like I've had many conversations with someone who is a threat hunter, and their day-to-day is exactly the same as mine, and vice versa, right? So I put it in a Venn diagram because, love Venn diagrams. Yeah, I kind of represented it as this huge overlap where, regardless of whether you say detection or hunt, if you're falling in the green, you're probably saying the same thing and just calling it something different. But in this particular post, what I talk about is that, really they are different things, and they have different comparative advantages. So threat detection, it has a few requirements. It needs to be automatable. So you have to be able to have the logs coming in regularly. You have to be able to run a query that terminates under whatever your Steam platform's, max runtime is. You have to be able to make a fairly high fidelity detection on it to be able to say this really is probably malicious, or you're going to wear out your threat response or your SOC, right? So those things, those techniques or whatever that we can automate, detect with high confidence with the existing logs, those really are best covered by threat detection because it's automatic, it's recurring. It means that it provides us ongoing protection against those attack techniques rather than a point-in-time check, right? And that obviously is better from a probability standpoint. However, there are things that don't fit into that bucket, right? So there are things that maybe we don't collect that data all the time, and it's a week-long effort to get it, right? Or maybe it's something where we're going to have to actually run a script for a week or 2 weeks to process all of that data and do all the enrichment before we can get to a point where an analyst looks at it, spends a couple of days saying, this was weird, but it's normal, and this was weird, but it's bad, right? Threat hunting is totally comfortable with that level of, anomalous time, uncollected, all of those things. So really my kind of case is like, let's detect what we can detect and let's hunt everything else. And bringing it kind of back to the whole picture, if we can build our percentage coverage up with our threat detection, that's great. That gives us that probability of winning. And then if on top of that, we can go out and threat hunt and look for things we can't detect, that just pushes it up even higher. Because now an attacker has to avoid not only what we've detected, what we've built detections automatically for, but they also have to just worry that we might just stumble across them when we go out and hunt through our network, right? Which, again, just makes that game harder for them and better for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I think you called out a key distinction, the automation component that we employ in threat detection versus there's going to be some things that we have to kind of sift through and look through manually. And oftentimes that involves the hunt, right? It also kind of takes a hypothesis approach oftentimes where we're kind of going at this thinking, if they were on my network, here's what I might observe. How can I go out and collect those signals, even if I don't have a detection for it? So with that, I think we're wrapping up here. Would appreciate everybody joining. Would love to, if anybody's got any questions, happy to take those now. Or if you made it this far, congrats. This was an intense one, and Andrew, can't thank you enough for doing this, for sharing your insights and blog post with us. So if you got questions, feel free to throw them in. Otherwise, thanks for joining.
Hey Tim, I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
If you don't mind me just putting my hat in the ring here. What do you call a sheep who can sing and dance?
Oh boy.
Lady Bye Bye.
What? Say it again.
Lady Bye Bye. Sheep that can sing and dance now.
JD. No, I mean, if you have to explain it, I mean, thank you for that.
Threw my hat in. All right, there you go.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Doesn't look like there's any other questions in the chat, but if you guys want to hop on and just ask them, you certainly may do so. But other than that, it was an incredible presentation. A lot of feedback as well in the chat. You guys make quite the duo. there wasn't a dull moment where I wasn't transfixed like to the screen like a toddler watching Cocomelon. Like it was very, very insightful, very valuable. I hope everyone shares the same sentiment. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you follow Andrew VanVleet on Medium. He's posting content pretty regularly, and you can stay on top of his research and all of his insights in the threat detection space. And here on at Detection Engineering Dispatch, we're all about empowering the community to collaborate on content like this. So stay tuned for our next episode that we're going to talk about all things AI chatbots, which is another very hot but also somewhat controversial topic in security. We'll hear from Oliver Rochford, author of the Curious AI newsletter, futurist evangelist in this space. We'll talk about what's wrong, what's right with them in bringing these assistants into our life. So that episode's going to take place next month, because 2 weeks from now will be the 4th of July. So I hope everyone has a lovely holiday for those that celebrate it. And we'll see you all very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good one.